As many of the speakers have already identified this morning, legislation is a key issue relative to the role of veterinary paraprofessionals in society. And what I hope to accomplish this morning is to give you an overview of OIE's standards relative to veterinary legislation, with an emphasis on those aspects of veterinary legislation that relate to veterinary paraprofessionals, their regulation, their roles, responsibilities, and opportunities. Okay. So I'd like to start with a slide on the importance of legislation in society in general. And basically this statement is a testimony to the importance of the rule of law. And it says that legislation is the essential function of modern government. It is the way that we direct and manage the complex social, economic, and technological systems that constitute modern society. Legislation, therefore, is the way that we as people act collectively to control and improve the world in which we live. The quality of the legislation we enact determines whether we as a society will prosper or decline, and possibly even whether we will survive or perish. And that may seem rather dramatic, but in fact, when you look at issues of disease control or disease spread for humans and animals, and food safety, in fact, these are issues of life and death in the veterinary domain. Okay. So if we focus a little more specifically on the importance of veterinary legislation, we can say that veterinary legislation provides the powers and authorities necessary for veterinary services to efficiently carry out their key functions to ensure public safety and to promote the public good. And today, in the face of growing global demand for foods of animal origin, increases in world trade, shifting patterns of disease associated with climate change, and the emergence and reemergence of diseases that can rapidly spread across international borders, more than ever, veterinary services must be supported by effective and modern legislation in order to do the job effectively. Couple of definitions. What do we mean when we say veterinary legislation? It means the collection of specific legal instruments, primary and secondary, which means primary laws or acts and the regulation that supports them, required for the governance of the veterinary domain. And what do we mean by the veterinary domain? It means all the activities that are directly or indirectly related to animals, their products and byproducts, which help to protect, maintain, and improve the health and welfare of human beings, including by means of the protection of animal health and welfare and food safety. So as veterinarians, we think of ourselves working primarily with animals, but in fact, we are working in service of the well-being of human society through our work with animals. Okay. Dr. Elwa alluded to good governance in the veterinary domain. It's recognized as a global public good, and that legislation is a key element in achieving good governance. Chapter 3.4 of the Terrestrial Code, which she mentioned, was adopted by the OIE World Assembly of Delegates in May of 2012 and provides the framework for the OIE standards on veterinary legislation, and Chapter 3.4 will represent the bulk of the remainder of my presentation. The objective of the chapter is to provide advice and assistance to OIE members when formulating or modernizing their legislation so as to comply with OIE standards, thus ensuring good governance of the entire veterinary domain. Okay. So what are the objectives of veterinary legislation? It's to provide a legal basis for the effective regulation of the veterinary domain so as to achieve food security, food safety, human health and safety, human welfare, and the safety of international trade. So I think it's worthwhile to take a closer look at the schematic diagram that Dr. Elwa showed you, looking at in more detail at the specifics of the veterinary domain with three particular goals in mind. One is to identify how complex the veterinary domain is, and in the context of having veterinary legislation that provides regulation of the entire veterinary domain means that the legislation also has to be complex because the domain itself is complex. And thirdly, as we go through it, in the context of this meeting, we should be thinking about where in the context of the veterinary domain are there roles for veterinary paraprofessionals and what qualifications and what levels of supervision might be required for veterinary paraprofessionals working in those particular areas. So if we start, we have the primary resource that we're concerned with, which is our national livestock resource in each of our own countries, and the end goal is to promote human health and security. And the name of the game is to control disease at every critical control point to limit its spread and promote good health.